Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me and the Children's Rights Alliance. I really couldn't actually turn down the invitation, because in the letter that Hilary wrote to me, she said that the Children's Rights Alliance are working together to make Ireland one of the best places in the world to be a child. And I thought that is a most fantastic goal. And I only wish that I could see that in my context. I think it's a wonderful goal, and I thought I had to come, therefore, and hopefully have a discussion with you and hear about the Irish perspective. I mean, clearly the issue of migrant children is now an issue right across Europe. It's not a new issue, actually. It's only a new issue because of the numbers of people that have now moved across Europe. But it's been, we've started doing research in the late 90s, we had a large number of asylum-seeking refugee children coming in under the Labour government, and the schools were then actively trying to do something to help those children. So this is not a new issue, but the politics of the era are very different. And so I'll be talking much more about the current situation than the past. I especially chose a title called Empowering the Newly Arrived Child, the Challenges of Diversity, Communication and Social Morality. The word empowering to me is the word that's the most important. People don't use it. It's not a word we associate with migrant children or refugee asylum-seeking children. We do talk about rights, we do talk about how to help integrate, include, etc. But empowerment has far more than that, and therefore my argument right from the beginning is that rights are not sufficient. We have to have even more, give more thought to how we give children and migrant children and families the right to decide their own lives and to take control of the decisions around them. On the whole, I think you might agree with me that refugees generally are seen in some ways as victims, and they're victims in terms of being stateless and statusless. Zygmunt Bauman talked about them as the other in the midst and as the flotsam of globalization. They're out of place, and that makes it very difficult for societies to actually relate to them because they're not in the right place from the beginning. And that concept of being out of place is what we're all trying to grapple with. I'm going to talk about a range of issues in relationship to empowerment, obviously I'm focusing on the schools and the teaching profession, but I'm very well aware that these issues relate to those of us who are working in the social services, in charities, in mental health, etc. And so it's I think the same sort of issues, and frankly, the more joined up the professions are, the better it will be for migrant families and their children. We don't really talk much about joining up. It's much more about separate services, and only some instances do we see really effective joining up from the school's point of view. One of the issues is that the children that come in, I'm talking from a British perspective, obviously, and I think that we have similarities between the British and the Irish perspectives as far as I've talked to Hilary. In Britain, the child is almost immediately, if their home language is not English, they're immediately classified as English. They'd have English as additional language needs, the EAL child. And the statistics that are collected are about the EAL child, not about refugees or asylum seekers, and not about whether they're children of economic migrants. They are just classified as a language category. And this is highly problematic. When we asked through telephone surveys a whole range of local authorities about where they placed the children and their families, they didn't say they were placed within the equality policies that they already had, or the race policies that they already had, or the gender policies, or even necessarily the inclusion policies, because they were placed under the language policy, and that we had to provide help with English. And that's got a beneficial side to it. It's certainly caring, because obviously it's really important to speak the national language. And it does give you access to employment potentially, to success in the education system and to employment. So it's got its beneficial side, but at the same time, it's not a valid statistical category. And one of the arguments we've made when we went into schools, and there's the Bell report, Bell Foundation funded major research on how schools respond to children whose language is not English, mother tongue's not English. The category had no educational value as such because it doesn't actually differentiate between bilingual children, different levels of language proficiency, multilingual children. You can have a French child who doesn't speak English versus a refugee who's got 6 languages, and they're all, none of them English, but they're all in the same statistical box. It doesn't differentiate children by their poverty, and of course poverty is one of the biggest issues that face migrant children coming into a country. It doesn't differentiate them statistically by their ethnic or religious group. A child who's been racialized in terms of be seen as a race category. So it's not actually helpful to some extent to keep that as the focus. And we have challenged that in our research and saying we have to rethink this because the statistics don't help us answer the question, how do children fare in our education system? We can't answer that question from that category. They become almost immediately, since they haven't got English as a mother tongue, a problem. And there is an American called Cody who talked about there are 3 discursive frames. You can have those who are newly arrived who are seen as a problem, those who are seen as having a right, and those who are seen as an opportunity. On the whole, they're seen as more of a problem than a right, and as having rights, and more as and certainly rarely in terms of an opportunity. And in fact, we have in our research, we went into local authorities and asked them to identify schools that they thought were doing fantastic work. And in that context, they were seeing the presence of such children as a fantastic opportunity. They saw it as internationalizing the school. They saw it as educating the local kids about the world and the world they live in. And they saw it as an enormous opportunity to meet children with incredible resilience and agency and a high level of motivation. Much, much higher motivation in many cases than the working class disadvantaged child. So there were lots of opportunities there that they saw, which I'll come back to. So I'm going to, from this perspective, I'm going to talk about, there were 2 major projects we did. The first one was actually going into schools. We published in 2010, so it was that in that context we associated asylum with compassion. Biblically, that is what it's about. It's about having compassion to give somebody a home when they're in trouble or in need or being persecuted. So we went into schools, and it's a fascinating exercise to do, is we interviewed teachers and said, what is compassion? And how do you create it? And that was fascinating. And the teachers certainly tried very hard to answer what they thought compassion was as a moral value. We also interviewed what we call the citizen children, who could have been Pakistani British or white British, all different types of citizen children. And then we also interviewed asylum-seeking refugee children, the non-citizen child. And the second piece of research we did was more about the European migrants children, Latvians, Lithuanians, Russians, etc., who of course have many similarities in terms of education. There's the refugee children in terms of trying to progress in an English education system. And we went to find out about how the schools responded to the language demands and to the integration issues and what these, particularly secondary schools, were doing. And I'll be referring to some of those findings. So the 3 agendas that I'm going to talk about, the first one is about what is a holistic approach and what we found from the first project around compassion, belonging, and rights. The second one is what we call the EAL education triangle. We constructed a triangle that had language, integration, and achievement as the 3 elements that we feel all should be linked together. And the third one, the empowerment agenda, I'm just going to sift out some of the things we found about the homeschool, what we call the school-home-school communication, and that's with migrant families. It's an area that's under-researched around the relationship between the families and the school. Far too little attention's been given to that. Okay, so if we start with the first one, the research, obviously we had gone to visit schools that were potentially the most compassionate, and I'm not claiming they were representative of every school in Britain. However, when we did interview them, you can see that the teachers that we were interviewing were incredibly compassionate teachers. As a profession, as we know, teachers are taught to care. They're taught to care for children. And the responses we were getting was quite clear that any child that walks through the school door is a child, not a migrant, not an immigrant. And that the child is there, and it doesn't matter where you come from. Their child has educational needs, and we're going to help that child. And in fact, the children would say the teacher is the most humane person I've met in England, because the teachers were unbelievably caring for these children, to the extent that they became almost manqué mothers and fathers to the children, helping them in the most caring way, trying to support them, trying to think of what their needs were. But teachers from the government point of view are seen as the front line. The English model of response is actually an invisible policy. We don't really have a fully worked out national policy on how to help migrant children or newly arrived children. We have to say newly arrived because we have so much diversity in Britain that there are many different ethnic groups already in the country, and third, fourth generation. So we're talking about the newly arrived child. The model is that the school should take responsibility, that it's up to the school, it's up to the teachers to deal with it. This is difficult. This is at a time when local government has been massively cut back. Cut back in its roles and responsibilities, in its funding, in its ability to work with schools controlling their own budgets. It has lost power, funding, and potential to help. And it also means that there's no sharing of knowledge as a result. So it's very hard for teachers and schools to know what sources of support they can draw on without a set policy. This compares enormously with, for example, Sweden, which has a national policy, has an incredibly well-developed approach to the newly arrived children, but there you do wonder whether the approach is actually put into practice at school level. So we have two totally contrasting approaches, one with the top down and the other one meant to be from the bottom up. The schools, you could argue that the UN, the Declaration of the Rights of the Child, is the key agenda, but it's a very difficult agenda to operate if citizen rights are being undermined, if citizen rights are not recognized. You can't argue for human rights in a context where the country is actually trying not to give citizenship. It's very hard to put those things together. And I don't think that we can actually achieve human rights in a context where we've got what is called in England, in Britain, a hostile environment. The government has clearly made it clear that we have to have a hostile environment so that people don't feel they can settle in the country. Well, in that context, it's very hard then to protect the rights of the child. Whether it's in terms of staying with the community, staying with your own family, linking with your family when you're coming in from Calais, for example, to come and join your family, or whether it's in terms of access to a good school, in terms of protection from violence, or even just to not have what people call a bare life, a life with actual no resources, no facilities because you're so poor, because your parents can't work. This is before you've achieved any form of citizenship. Now, in that context, the issue is it's a powerful discourse, but that's why I'm asking the question whether it's enough. It is, of course, these children need these rights, but is it enough? Now, from the school's point of view, the most caring schools we interviewed were using a holistic approach. They saw that they were going to educate the whole child, not just performance in exams. They were going to deal with all the needs of the child as best they could. And this meant constructing, as far as they could, a very positive image about cultural diversity. That was the starting point, that this would be a school that cultural diversity was something to be celebrated, and within that would be the child, the migrant child. that they would integrate the biopsychosocial needs of the child. In other words, they'd work closely with psychiatric services and dealing with trauma. Schools have very different views about this. I went to a school in London where the whole of the front lobby was filled with the art of refugee children who'd been through a war, and it was the most violent, horrendous art you've ever seen, with cut-off arms and heads and blood everywhere. Now, their argument, the teachers, was it's better to express the violence than not. Others might say it's actually traumatized the whole school to see this art. Difficult, isn't it? How do you deal with trauma in the context of a school? They said that they would have new indicators of successful integration. Integration doesn't mean just succeeding at maths and English and science. Integration means that when the child feels safe, they feel they belong, but more than that, that they're actually participating in all the activities and they're part of the whole school culture. And then they feel they've actually succeeded. Although there is a question mark that keeps on coming up, and I'd be interested to know your views, is do teachers have a responsibility to create friendships among children? And friendships is one of the hardest things to have. The interviews we did with asylum-seeking children was they could be friends at school, but they'd never been invited to the houses of the children. Is it the duty of the teacher to help generate friendship? And can they? And so integration it's always got a little boundary in there about how far can you be integrated in that particular space. The caring ethos, of course, is part of the holistic approach. There was a wonderful example of the teacher who took the kids, the refugee kids, off climbing in a gym, climbing up, because they said it's better to learn to be frightened of heights, so there are other things to be frightened of than war, so that they could learn to think about how they dealt with their fears. These were superb schools, in my view, and the head teacher was in one of them. Admittedly, he'd been trained as a social scientist. However, he actually, at the open day for parents, and I'll just give you this little example, at the open day when all the schools are competing for pupils, you get money for the number of pupils you recruit. And it said, we are I'm quoting, a genuine multi-class, multicultural, comprehensive school. Every child has equal value. We are absolutely clear. We open our doors to refugees and asylum seekers. Many schools don't want them. We welcome them, welcome being a key word here. We are a global village school. But the key thing he said, which was enormously courageous, if you don't want your child to be sitting beside such students in class, befriending them, accepting them, making them welcome, and above all learning from them, then perhaps it's definitely not a good idea to come to our school. Now, I challenge you to think whether you would have the courage to say that to parents. When the test is there's a test in here, isn't it? Does this inclusive model work, the holistic model work? And when we interviewed the children, we asked the, quote, citizen British kids, we gave them what we called Blair's dilemma. At the time, Tony Blair was Prime Minister. And we said, if you were Tony Blair, where would you put your money? What would you do with all the immigrant kids that are coming into the country? What would your advice be? And we showed them examples of stories of different refugee children as well to see if they could display compassion at the end of it. And they said they were terribly positive and said the stories were absolutely awful. And of course it would be awful if it happened to somebody, like me. If I was going through that, I would feel terrible. And there was tremendous signs of caring and empathy, real empathy and sympathy that was coming through. However, they also said, but maybe it's not such a good idea to stay in Britain. And they said, because there's so much racism in Britain that maybe they'd be safer in another country. Also, we're a bit overcrowded in Britain. The island seems to be sinking. And these are secondary school kids. And he says, well, perhaps because of the lack of space, perhaps they could go to Russia, the Isle of Wight, Ireland, or Canada. So they had a sort of sympathy that went so far, right? But they were trying to be on side. When we asked them, do you think these kids could ever be British? And they said, well, they certainly could be British, and we'd be happy for them to be British because they could have a British passport. But they could never be English. The key thing for them about being English is they don't eat fish and chips. There is a cultural message in an identity that is impossible to have unless you have been brought up and you have the blood. I mean, I don't know why other people can't eat fish and chips, but they can't because they're not English. There is a sense in which there was a tension between the working class kids that we were interviewing in London and the asylum-seeking child, because the working class kid in London, the refugee kids thought they were unbelievably disrespectful, potentially violent, carrying knives, had absolutely no motivation to learn, and they wanted to learn. They were enormously respectful. They dealt with a lot of them were Muslim, and they were wanting to learn. And they actually had this distance around how the kids responded to the teacher, that they were more wanting to be the good pupil, and the other kids were somewhat dissing the teachers. The most radical of teachers, and this is where it is relevant on children's rights, the more radical politicized teachers were repositioning themselves vis-à-vis the state. They were the ones who were going to fight deportation of children. They were going to help with campaigns to save families. There was manifestos produced by teachers about, we the teachers do not accept what is happening to children in our country. That was a good few years back, and I don't know if it's been revamped since then. We have got access and delays in getting into schools. The children don't necessarily find schools to go to until a long time after they've been here. There are now something like, in terms of detention of children, 1,649 children, 600 of whom are under 11, were detained since the government officially ended child detention in 2010. Children are being deported. The children's rights issue, that is where some of the nub of children's rights is hitting. And there is considerable concern in some aspects of the press about what is happening with children who are being detained and deported. In some cases, the more politically aware teachers were engaging the children in their school in campaigns by helping write letters to MPs, by trying to help the families. I mean, the grief that is actually tangible in the classroom when somebody is deported or taken away is enormous, and the teachers have to pick up the pieces. Okay, now that is my first agenda. That is the issue around the tensions. My message there is you cannot integrate children without actually working with the, quote, citizen children. You can't just talk about the needs or the rights. You have to talk about the whole school and the whole child approach. And one needs to work with the communities of children in the school in a very active way, because that's how the needs of the asylum-seeking child will be addressed. From a pedagogic point of view, we have another way of thinking about this. In our second project, we designed this triangle, and we said, if you go into a school, we could look at how schools address the needs of the EAL learners. Now, as I've pointed out, most schools look at language development. They're worried about how quickly the children can learn English and function in the classroom and pick up the curriculum. And we call this the education triangle, EAL education triangle, this one. And this is in our report. The problem with this is that these are three elements. Educational achievement of the child is meant to be the end result. And language development is meant to help educational achievement. And language development is meant to help social integration. Or you could argue social integration is meant to help language development. If you have friends who speak English, you might improve your English. If you have integration and language, you might improve achievement. It's not clear which way the arrows are going here. And it's not clear schools know which way the arrows are going. But they're all interlinked. And it's actually quite important to think about those three elements. And the problem is we don't necessarily have them a coherent model of a policy approach within a school that could link these three things. So if I start with educational achievement, what actually happens is schools on the whole, we found, do not know how well the children are doing. This is for a number of reasons. They don't necessarily track their progress other than in English. They don't have a statistical category that makes it easy, as I said, to do it. they are, on the whole, statistically, it's very hard sometimes to go into a school and ask who are the refugee or asylum-seeking children, because sometimes they won't know. They don't want to know because it's not an educational variable. There's also an argument that children don't want to be known in that way because it makes them stigmatized if it becomes too visible. But on the other hand, without any statistics, you're less likely to get funding. And we had this debate in the 1980s about ethnic monitoring. And I'd be very interested to hear in Ireland whether you collect information at school level about the different backgrounds of children and where they're coming from and how well they're doing in the school system. And what we're beginning to see in some studies is that the differences between, if you just take the Eastern Europeans, you might have the Czech students do very well, and the Latvians, but not the Russians and the Poles. It really is quite interesting which groups do well in the English school system. And there, of course, behind that are how educated are the parents, what work they're doing, etc. So the first thing we've argued for is that if one had those sort of statistics, one could at least start to do what I would call a migration audit in each school. I know that, Dipper and I will remember how we did gender audits in school. How are girls doing in a school? We haven't even started to do a migration audit. How are children with different backgrounds, different levels, years of residence, different needs, progressing educationally in terms of achievement? We know that there are really thousands of children with English as additional language. One of the things that we raised, I've got a figure here, for example, of 29,000 children, and 29,500 children in England, 10,000 in Scotland, and 31,000 in Wales. We're talking about more than 15 to 19% of a school. In some schools in London, we might have up to 60, 70% of children whose home language is not English. You'd think this is another thing we noticed when we went into schools. How do you know how capable a child is? How do you know what their capabilities are? How do you know what their potential is? We've discovered that schools, when they do test the children on induction, do it in English. It's not a bilingual test. So of course they're testing English language proficiency rather than their capabilities. And so one of the arguments is how is the capability of the child assessed? Because once they're assessed, they're placed in streams or they're placed in sets, and they could be located in the special needs category or in the lower sets, which might be way off from where they should be in terms of their own abilities. So we've been arguing that there should be bilingual testing at the point of arrival, the induction point. And I'd be interested to know how Ireland assesses children on arrival. There is increasing interest in having what is like an education passport, which might then indicate what children are really capable of. You can have a Russian child, for example, who is fantastic at maths or chess, but again, the questions may not ask about chess. Or you might have a sports person with enormous capabilities. And I was arguing years ago for a passport. UNICEF is now arguing that we should have a standard framework where you'd know when a child moves country what level of maths they've reached, what level of English they've reached. We're moving in that direction, and I'm sure in the next few years we're going to see that. The issue around social integration, I've already referred to the relations between children, which is not getting enough attention. And I'm on a project in Norway where they're trying to link the Norwegian kids to the refugee kids. They're not getting a huge take-up by the Norwegian kids. The challenge is, and I'd love to hear about projects here, how do you get the Irish children to talk to the newly arrived child, to work with, or projects that do that sort of work, because that's really, at the community level, is what is needed. The relationship, if you like, between the majorities and the minorities has become more and more of an issue. The language development, I'll talk just very briefly about. We found that the children were learning English. The money runs out after 3 years in the school, so they don't, which is not enough time to support English language development. Britain mainstreams children immediately. Unlike many other countries, it puts the children straight into the an English school and gives them language support if they can afford it, and that's gone down, the amount of language support that's available, extra language support. What's an issue is writing. They're finding that the children get a way of talking and talking to friends, but the writing is a problem, and there's not enough emphasis on writing. And one of my colleagues, Yon Chan Lui, and Professor Lung at London have now developed a language assessment framework, so that and it's on the web and it's free from the Bell Foundation, and it shows that and it's been taken up by 2,000 schools already. It's showing you can map how the child's learning reading, writing, listening, understanding, and so it's giving a method of tracking the child's progress within English. But the other aspect is that we're finding that the kids themselves are having trouble with the humanities subjects. They can handle the science and maths better, because the humanities just needs a high level of English, and we are aware that schools actually need to teach academic English. It's a different English, and they're not focusing on academic English, as we would call it. These are the sorts of issues that are emerging out of our research, and there's so much work. But what we're finding is that schools don't have a language development policy. When we went into classrooms, we found every single teacher had a different view of how to use home languages. You know, you can either have an English-only class, you can use your home language sometimes, or you can use it in the playground sometimes, or you can have all the time using Google Translate in the classroom. And so the school do not have a consistent language policy. The child is totally confused about when they can speak their language or not speak their language. It's really quite difficult. The language policy is not being tracked. It's a specialist area as opposed to a mainstream area, but mainstream teachers have to deal with it. And therefore we are really saying, should there be far more training of teachers in how to deal with the language issue? And certainly the trainee teachers that I'm in charge of at the moment are all saying English as a second language is the biggest issue they face. So finally, my last one is around empowerment. And the empowerment issue gets down to what Claudia Schneider and I have really really became aware of. We came through with the gender equality policies. We came through with race equality policies. I think the issue for us now is communication policy. Schools do not seem to have a communication policy on how to communicate between teachers, between management and parents and pupil, between the management and the staff, about these children's needs, between the staff and the teaching staff, between the teachers and the pupils, between the pupils and the families and the communities. And if we just take number 6, which is very important, is the relationship of how do schools communicate with families, particularly if they haven't got English as their home language, but all migrant children. They're coming in with a very different set of values around what is education, what is the role of the parent, what is the role of the teacher. And when we read into the literature from America about the Latinos in America, there's a rich literature there about parent-school relationships. And they're talking about how the Latino community came in with a notion of personalmente, which is that it's a very personal relationship, not a bureaucratic one. The little notes that come home do not fulfill the idea of personalmente. They had a view about that we're in it together, that we talk about moral values, that we're talking about ways of being, and that's what's important in education. And so they had a model of schooling that didn't fit the model that was being offered to their children. what we found in our research is, of course, there are numerous stereotypes about where these families come from, what their values are like, do they work hard, you know, are these families lazy, are these families good parents, are these families interested in schooling? When they don't turn up we've seen this before, haven't we, with disadvantaged kids. They must be not interested because they haven't come to the parents' evening. The model is very narrow on how we communicate. And with parents, it's notes home, which sometimes are translated. It's parents' evening, and then the last one is you're called in when your kid's in trouble. And those are the three models. They don't work with migrant communities. They fundamentally don't work. And it's really what we say is that the presence of migrant children and newly arrived children is a litmus test for how well the school is actually working with parents and communities, or parents or carers. And when we found a heavy dependence on Google Translate, the most imaginative schools had got on their website the facility to turn every piece of information into 7 languages so that you could click on every single language of the school and turn all the instructions into your home language. In America, the most empowering was where the parents were given a voice on the school board. They were either you get a representative of that community, which they choose, or they have you can have a representative or a subcommittee that talks about the experiences of those children who are not familiar with the education system that they're having to enter. We found that the parents that we did manage to interview, and it's extremely hard to interview the parents, I don't know if you found that, Dipna, it's very, very hard to get parents to trust you to be interviewed. They did not know about the English school system. They really didn't know the curriculum, the homework policy, the exams policy. The school was not giving them information that helped them choose and help their children. But these parents were doing homework all the time with their children. They were massively aspirational and motivated parents, but they were seen as at a distance or potentially a potential failure as a parent, which really wasn't very fair. And one of the things that we argued really was that it would be what was important was that communication with the parents and the communities, and one could argue this for all children, couldn't we? It's the same issue for all children, particularly for secondary schools. It's much harder in secondary schools, is that it should be two-directional, not linear, not just interactional, but circular, home, school, home, a rolling dynamic communication process which carries families with them. And the more we get demographic change, the more we get children on the move coming into our countries, which is going to never stop, the more we need to think through that the model, the one-size-fits-all model that we've been using, has to shift. And it has to become much more dynamic. And we need more information about what families are, where they come from, what are their educational histories, and how they're going to work with the school. So we've emphasized the need for communication policy, if you like, in order to develop, to give the children those rights, because without that, the children in the end will not achieve and not expand their well-being in our societies. Even if they were only here temporary, this is still very important. In conclusion, fundamental to the needs of the newly arrived is the challenge between the us and the them. And I've had many conference talks and things where we're trying to think what's happening in Europe. What is the responsibility of the education system? It isn't just rights and needs or even opportunities. It's actually, we've seen the rise of the right. We've seen the rise of enormous hostility and fear about the migrant communities and the changing populations, the changing demography. And it does lead us to the question, what is the role of the school in terms of engaging in that issue, taking that on, because those are the conditions which will help these families and and their lives and their livelihoods. And it's actually challenging the fear that is being generated, challenging the media representations, thinking through, and people have argued that the only way forward is to go back to the notion of humanity. and that it's a larger concept to find the common humanity, for children to see the common humanity in a changing world, and that will be much more important. And I was very struck by the writing of, if I can pronounce it properly, Ainsley O'Donnell, who is from at Limerick, and she's written a book called The Inclusion Delusion, which I think is a very interesting book indeed. And she says it's not actually about hospitality, it's not just about needs, these are concepts that imply that they are joining us. It's actually about encouraging children to see the plurality, the sheer diversity and richness of humankind, and taking a new moral stance that's much more appropriate to this century. And within that, to hear the voices of the excluded and the newly arrived, and that the voices become a part of how we can then engage in seeing what we have in common. And I think that is the theme that we're now seeing in a lot on coming into the political agenda, what we have in common rather than what we don't have. And some people are optimistic, and perhaps the new globalized world with all the movements of people, maybe we are looking at the beginning of, as Bonaventura dos Santos, a very famous Portuguese writer, philosopher, said, maybe we're looking at the beginnings of a new era of global, even cosmic solidarity.